Please welcome PJ Hagerty. He is the founder of DevRelate.io, and he's going to talk about Rails and what some of the alternatives are. And I'm really excited about this because I think he's not just going to like list alternatives. I think he's going to talk about like when's the right time, right? Every computer scientist or developer I know always says use the right tool for the job. And I want to learn more about what PJ thinks about what various options are for various jobs. PJ, go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Cool. Thank you. And thanks everybody for having me. I was really excited. I've always wanted to speak at Boulder Ruby, like back when things were like in the real world. And I never got the chance. So like, I'm even more excited to be here and get here and see that like some of my friends who I've known for years are here, like Elise, who I don't think I think we've only been in like the same city that we've hung out in 2 times, like in Pittsburgh, but every other time it's some other city. Yeah. No, I think we hung out in Seattle at one point in time. I think when RailsConf was there, or might not have been Seattle, might have been Portland.
I think it was Denver. I think it was Denver.
Maybe it was Denver.
It was Denver, yeah.
But we're globetrotting friends. We like to make it cool. And Kirk, who of course used to work with me, engineered. Yeah.
Sorry, real quick. We're planning to record this. I just want to make sure you weren't on when we said we were going to before. So if you're not comfortable,
that's totally cool. No, that's totally awesome.
Cool, thanks.
But as Dan said, so yeah, I'm the founder of DevRelate.io. I'm currently working at a company called Mattermost. So to tell you a little bit about them, if you don't know does anyone not know what Mattermost is? It's okay if you don't. It's the tagline is a high trust open source collaboration platform built for developers. What it is open source on-prem Slack. You customize it the way you want it. It's a lot easier. So I mostly work for them. I still do some work with DevRelate.io, which is one of the reasons why I have my Engineer t-shirt on, because I still do some work for Engineer too. And I also do work for open sourcing mental illness. I will never not plug them when I speak. So if you don't know about osmihelp.org, you should check it out. We're a full service mental health organization that helps talk about mental health and tech. We do conferences all over the world. We have an entire team of speakers to speak at any event. So if ever Boulder Ruby decides they want a mental health and tech speaker, please just reach out to me and let me know. Also, I am obligated to say we accept donations because that's how we function. We're a 501(c) charitable organization, tax deductible, blah, 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 blah. But check out osmihelp.org. We have all kinds of resources and stuff to get you started on, taking a look at your mental health. And that's something else that Elise knows a lot about, because in the first ever Steel City Ruby conference, Elise was part of the team that brought Greg Bogus to that conference. And he was at the time speaking for MH Prompt, which eventually got moved into OSMI, and brought the house down with a talk about bipolar and ADD and how to deal with mental health. And it's really important. We should really take care of ourselves. It's not why I'm here to talk though, but definitely check out OSMI and what they do. So what am I here to talk about? So before we get started, there's a little bit of an elephant in the room that we have to discuss. I don't hate Rails. When I was developing this talk, a lot of people started asking like, ooh, isn't this going to be kind of a big deal? God forbid DHH ever finds out I'm talking about this. But like, to address the elephant in the room, Rails is great. It really is what you need for large scale production applications most of the time. It has history. And if you just got started in Ruby working on the web, chances are Rails is what you are most familiar with. And that's perfect. That's awesome. And you ask yourself, why is it Ruby so great? Like, what makes it so cool? Why is Rails a cool thing? Many developers come to Rails by default. Maybe you started as a Ruby hobbyist and, back in the day, 20 years ago, you're like, Ruby is cool and I like it. But I need to build this application for the web because everybody loves the web. So you moved on to Rails, which was the first way to really get Ruby on the web. Although I know Kirk Haynes is going to disagree with me on that because we just talked about that earlier this week. But for all intents and purposes, most people knew Rails as the first way to get Ruby on the web. Maybe you learned to code at a boot camp where Ruby on Rails is still the preferred teaching method because its ease of use and its ability to be installed universally, even on Windows, like Ruby on Rails is the way to go. Rails, when it arrived on the scene, shook up the entire world, like all of open source, all of web development, it was crazy. There was finally like an alternative to Java. There was an alternative to PHP. There was an alternative to Perl. And it was super fun to use. Like, it was so awesome. There was magic in the air. And that's part of like the allure to Rails, right? Very early on, a guy named Miles Forrest was doing some videos to instruct people on how to use Ruby, and they were cool. And one of the quotes I remember from that, I don't know if Miles said it or DHH said it, but to build a web application Ruby on Rails, you get 90% of the work done in 10% of the time. Well, the last time 10% is like a huge pain in the crack, but like it was very attractive to say we'd get 90% of the work done. And granted, that 90% like meant, you know, to go back to the earlier talk, like it wasn't like there were no tests written. It was just like 90% it was there because it was scaffolded. But especially like dev shops looking to turn things over real quickly, or, you know, someone who's looking to convert legacy programs to a more modern language, Rails did things automatically. You had ways to handle database connections, and you didn't need to worry about straight up SQL queries or SQL queries. I'm not going to argue that point. I mean, heck, like Rails came with a built-in index page to let you know you're riding the Rails. There was so much instant gratification from Rails. It was amazing. But doing things automatically kind of came with a problem. A few years ago, RailsConf was in Atlanta. And for those of you who were there, you might remember this image because I did straight up steal it from DHH's keynote of that year. And this is why. Rails is huge. And huge comes with a cost. One of the costs is not being able to find things easily under the hood. And especially when you're talking about like open source stuff and monoliths, like people really like to tinker with things under the hood. When DHH said this, he said the monoliths were the way to go. And of course he was being deviant and defensive and defiant and, you know, trying to, you know, really shake it up and get people to pay attention. He wanted to talk about new features, but his focus during that talk was on why monoliths can be better than microservices or other methods that end up being like a division of application labor. And that's not a surprise. David's kind of part of the problem, and we love him, not here to smash DHH against the wall. Granted, he created this solution initially, but having that kind of benevolent dictator for life title can be a hindrance and part of this monolithic structure, part of this monolithic culture. But behind the politics of Rails, there's an underlying issue. And this is where we start to get into the nitty-gritty. This is where we start looking for alternatives. Once upon a time, there were only a few alternatives to Rails. So this is story time. Everybody can like get your blanket, get your, you cannot fall asleep while I'm talking though. That's not cool. So there were just a few alternatives to Rails if you want to do on the web. Today, that landscape has changed a lot. While we've never achieved like the full framework wars that we've seen in other languages like PHP, and that's really a blessing, not a burden, we have seen the growth of frameworks that can do specific jobs better and in a more streamlined way in comparison to Rails. So let's take a look at a few, and we'll start at the very beginning, like the super easy stuff. Let's start with Sinatra. I'm assuming a bunch of people have heard about Sinatra. If you haven't, here's a little intro to Sinatra. If you haven't seen it or you haven't at least checked it out, it's created by this guy named Blake Mizrahi way back in 2007. Sinatra was like one of the first steps towards using Ruby on the web without Rails. Excuse me. Since its inception, Konstantin Haase has been the main maintainer and still maintains a lot of it. He deserves a lot of the credit when it comes to making Sinatra a more recognizable name as time went on. He kind of evangelized the idea behind Sinatra. And the idea was simple. Based on using routes for the code to be activated, Sinatra is a lightweight solution for applications that doesn't need the overhead of Rails, which is pretty awesome. You can implement things as you go along. Even with the use of some of the API tools in Rails, Sinatra still had the upper hand when it came to building an application that is ingesting something from an external API. Because of its inherent simplicity, just focusing on routes, Sinatra focuses on the task at hand with none of the overarching strain of various parts that Rails can put on an application. Say there's no need to retain DB records. You just need to read and organize information that you pulled from an API. Cool. Why would you build a Rails application for that with all of the extra classes and modules and pieces, all those extra objects just hanging out doing nothing? Sinatra would be best for what you might need to do. And I have a great example of this. I had an app for a long time called Meetup Land. And all it did was pull from the meetup.com API, and it would say, you know, here's a list of the meetups you said based on location and types. So it was like, you know, had Ruby, PHP, Elixir, and you could click on these things and you'd be like, yeah, so here's the top, you know, 200 within 50 miles of you or whatever. That was really cool and worked really well up until the time that Meetupland changed, or Meetup.com changed their API, but that's another story for another time. If there's something that you need, the great thing here is like Sinatra had that flexibility and it could just do it. There was no need to have overhead. It was like a super tiny application. It was almost serverless. And if there was anything that I needed from Rails for the application that Sinatra doesn't do, you can just add it. See, Ruby has these things called gems, and really Rails is a collection of gems. It's kind of a loose framework in that sense. But Sinatra is written in Ruby, just like Rails. So you can add components like Active Record if you decide you need a database. It's a buffet. You have Sinatra at the very base handling your routes, then just add things in a little bit at a time. Awesome. But everything has its drawback and nothing is perfect. As we go through this talk, you'll notice that as I'm talking about each thing, I will be pointing out like where it's good and where it's maybe not so great. So Sinatra and some of the other alternatives on this list are going to have some ugly bits that we have to bring up. With Sinatra specifically, I already said it. It's like, wait, for a larger scale web application, Sinatra is not going to be what you want. It's really for applications dealing with like a few endpoints or few or not frequent concurrent users. So not heavy use and not heavy endpoints. Sinatra will crash if it's put under too heavy of a load. Even if you put it on a decent sized instance on AWS or on Heroku or wherever, or on Engine Yard, for example, it will still crash if there's too much use or it's just overburdened. Sinatra is not built for being overburdened. That, and as it is compatible with Rails, with components like Active Record and things like that, as your application grows, you might look at it and say, I've implemented half of Rails. So you're just spawning the need for converting to a Rails application, which is not difficult. And with a little foresight, you can avoid that being a difficult thing. It's kind of like, you know, you'll start wondering, why didn't I do Rails in the first place? So Sinatra is good for some small things, just not everything. Also, and I should put out this warning, so there was a thing out there called Almost Sinatra. So when you look for Sinatra's documentation, do not get fooled if you see a repository called Almost Sinatra. Be it known, maintainer Konstantin Hassa has a bit of a jokey side to him, and his sense of humor led him to an attempt to rewrite all of Sinatra in just 6 lines. That was a bad idea. To say it's unsafe but functional would probably be the best way to quote what he was trying to do. This is actually on the screen, the entirety of Almost Sinatra. You'll notice certain things like, no matter what, you get a 200 past. My God, it's the scariest thing ever. So for a laugh, check it out. Other than that, maybe make sure you pass around. Padrino. So we're kind of moving up the scale a little bit. Based on Sinatra at its core, Padrino is a lightweight, full stack Ruby framework. Unlike Sinatra, it has some features that are very Rails-like, such as methods for generating applications with Padrino G Project My App, like super simple, you know, scaffolding kind of stuff. Think of Padrino as Sinatra Part 2, or maybe like Sinatra's younger brother, younger but more robust sibling, I should say. Because that happens sometimes, right? Sometimes the second born is like so much more awesome than the firstborn. I'm a middle child. I know no one believes that. Part of the beauty of Padrino is the tooling. With support for many database libraries, along with testing and mocking tools, it goes a step further with a drop-in admin interface that is ORM agnostic and comes with scaffolding and authentication features. Like, that's kind of awesome. Essentially, Padrino is like a step between Sinatra and Rails. So it goes beyond the simplicity of Sinatra and allows a more complex application to grow. But it's not quite all of the overhead that you're seeing in Rails. However, we do kind of run into some of the same issues with Sinatra. Sure, more of what we need for a more robust application are available, but if we need to implement more and more things, aren't we kind of just implementing Rails again? I personally like Padrino for a lot of projects that are bigger than Sinatra, but not quite Rails ready. Think of like things that are like proof of concept applications that are probably going to be seeing production, probably going to be seeing a lot of users, but for the proof of concept, I don't need to do anything with Rails, and Padrino might be a real simple way to get it started. You'll notice that in these slides, there was a reference to the Godfather movie. Padrino is the Spanish word for Godfather. So hence the name Padrino, hence my little jokey jokes. I hope everyone is enjoying them. By the way, I can't see comments while I'm presenting, but if you have questions or anything, feel free to shout at me. So since we're on the topic of micro frameworks, which is what Sinatra and Padrino are, let's take a look at Cuba. Cuba is one of the most easy to start with micro frameworks currently available to Rubyus. Written by Michael Martans, the key to Cuba, like Sinatra, is simplicity. With the avoidance of the large-scale overhead, this micro framework is designed to build and deploy simple apps while avoiding bloat and unnecessary functionality. Yes, I did read that from a repo. That's totally okay. Like a lot of micro frameworks, though, Cuba is rack-based. Sinatra is also rack-based. Rack minimizes the interaction between the web server that supports Ruby and the framework itself. So that saves you some time in processing. And I know a lot of programmers, we all talk about time and processing, which, to be honest, like we care about it and the end users kind of don't care about it, but there it is. They care about 4 seconds. I have a whole other talk about 4 seconds. It lasts 45 minutes. But anyway, this whole rack setup, this helps to improve response time, and it makes using the framework, in this case, Cuba, fairly simple. It's kind of drag and drop. You still have to write your code. One of the best parts about Cuba is the documentation. A walkthrough guide is available online. It allows anyone to look into and take advantage of Cuba's functionality right away. You can have like barely any understanding of programming or understanding of Ruby, and you'll probably get an idea of it by going through the Cuba documentation. It's very hard to not say Cuban, but it's Cuba. After working for a short time with the walkthrough, you'll have like a simple Twitter clone called Frogger, which is pretty rad. At this point, we should be familiar enough with Cuba to start using our own projects if it's the right fit, to the revolution now, Cuba all the way, right? So there's a weird thing about Cuba. Like it's never quite been able to capture the Ruby community's attention, especially when you compare it to things like Padrino or Sinatra that just had a little like better job being evangelized. Like as such, Cuba doesn't, it's kind of has some outdated parts, especially these days, making it less compatible with modern applications and even modern versions of Ruby sometimes. Cuba also kind of suffers from limited focus. Similar to Sinatra, the main job is to build a minimal rack application. If you're looking for something with more infrastructure, a micro framework is probably not for you. So let's bring out some fully fleshed frameworks, the real thing, like something robust, something I can sink my teeth into. Hanami. If you think what we talk about here sounds like a lot like another framework that was called Lotus like 5-6 years ago, you should not be surprised. Lotus became Hanami a few years ago after a certain large corporation that I kind of worked for decided they didn't want to share the name Lotus, hence Hanami, created by Luca Guidi. It's a complete modern era framework that's shed some of the weight of Rails for better performance. So it's kind of like Rails perfected. There probably wouldn't be a Hanami if there wasn't a Rails, but at the same time, it gives us an opportunity to say like, this is a better version. Speed. Hanami has the features of a fully fleshed out framework, like I said, without the hard overhead that sometimes causes performance issues in Rails. This speed sometimes comes at the cost of having a few features that aren't readily available, but some of these are things like CoffeeScript features that were decided for the rest of the community and not for us, or action cable, which is like not super useful if you're not doing certain things. And other things that the Rails ecosystem always added, they were like, nice to have, but you might not need it. I always looked at some of the things like, especially action cable, like it's like a spare tire. That spare tire is your spare tire. So it's like a second spare tire. Like I have a spare tire, but like it's cool that I have this extra one just in case if I get two flats. But it's not really necessary. I don't need it per se. And I definitely shouldn't be paying extra performance costs because of it. Hanami seems to have been built with the purpose of directly competing with Rails. It wanted to have framework dominance. That's what it worked out of the box. That was what it was looking for. Of course, there are going to be some drawbacks. The pace of Hanami builds is one of its biggest drawbacks. While it might someday be a major player, and it is kind of a major player, I shouldn't say it's not. But like as far as Ruby frameworks go, like it's kind of working to achieve the fame. But it worked. It kind of got put together at a snail's pace, and the excitement behind it initially kind of tapered off a little bit as time went on. And part of that was because it was a one-man army. It was Luca working very hard on it, but also trying to get like his degree and have a family and work a job. And it's kind of difficult, to do an open source project and build a framework for an entire community when you're worried about, trying to make sure that you're putting food on the table. So part of this could be easily resolved by folks like the people at this meetup. Get involved, submit PRs, write some code. It's what open source is all about. The Ruby community is not exempt from this. If you try Hanami and you like it, but like such and such is missing, X is missing, whatever is missing, build the whatever and help make it better. And maybe we'll have something that competes with Rails. Volt is another framework that has been fresh in the mind of Rubyists recently. I realize I'm talking really fast here, but I get very excited about frameworks. This one has a focus on building a fast application and like eschewing the yak shaving. Volt offers the opportunity to get things moving like super fast. And I know that we've talked a lot about speed, but like Volt does it in kind of a different way. Instead of focusing on syncing data over HTTP, Volt works using a persistent connection, which is really different. And part of the reason for Volt's quickness is that it lives on top of Opal, which is a really amazing gem that translates Ruby to JavaScript conveniently. That's right, I said conveniently. Can I say speed here again for Volt's strength? Like speed. Volt focuses on like this persistent connection to bypass any time your code would normally have to take like a full-on trip to HTTP to sync data, which is awesome because the entire focus is on speed. You don't need to make those trips. They don't take as long going both ways. So compared to Rails, it's going to see a huge performance boost. And the use of Opal to translate things to JavaScript means less focus on dealing with JavaScript while writing code, which again translates to speed. This time we're talking about the speed of writing the code and developing the application as opposed to application performance speed. But this could be a performance metric that perhaps your boss uses on you, which is pretty rad. One inconvenience for Volt at the moment, as far as I know, it still only supports using MongoDB. And while MongoDB is a great database solution, it's not always what you want to use. What's that? I heard somebody say something. But yeah, but yeah, it seems to really focus on using MongoDB. It was a choice at the beginning of the creation of the framework. I'm not sure why. Maybe everyone who was working at Mongo at the time, I'm not sure. But in recent polls, like as soon as like up to like earlier, I think April of this year, someone did a poll, and most Rubyists, most programmers are using Postgres or MySQL. So that being the case, Volt might not be for you. If you're really into MongoDB and you want to do this kind of schema shift, that's cool. But that's the other weakness is most Ruby applications are written for the web and they're written with HTTP as the intended method of transfer. Well, it's not super hard to take into consideration when writing your code that it's going to be information is going to move in a different way. Writing in Volt means you have to take that into consideration. The whole persistent connection idea, it's a little bit different. Trailblazer is one of my favorite things to talk about, mostly because of its creator, longtime Rubyist and longer time punk rocker, Mr. Nick Sutterer. If you've never met Nick, you should. He's a joy to behold. The idea behind Trailblazer is to help Rails to work more efficiently as a framework by enforcing encapsulation and adopting more intuitive code structure. So in the beginning, Trailblazer was just kind of like an abstraction layer that you put on top of Rails, meaning that it wasn't like truly a framework, but more like a framework for the framework, if that makes sense. So an abstraction on top of an abstraction on top of an abstraction. But since then, Trailblazer has come a long way. One of the biggest strengths of Trailblazer is its focus on moving the business logic out of controllers and into other pieces of code. So this logic is moved to service objects known as operations. This makes the controllers and models more lean, and therefore they're more streamlined to use. Additionally, Trailblazer uses the code more dry, like don't repeat yourself is always something that Rubyists love to say, and then they deal with Rails and realize that it's not the case. It's really difficult, but Trailblazer tries to make that easier for you. And it tries to clean up your Ruby code a little bit so you don't have to worry about things that don't make sense. Again, it's about performance games. So like many things, the one weakness here, Trailblazer is very opinionated, very similar to Rails. The ideas stem from another project that Nick did called Cells. And Cells was a great idea, but it actually got rejected from the Rails core because they didn't feel it was necessary as something that everyone would want to use. That said, Trailblazer actually has a large community, and there's more and more sources on learning how to apply Trailblazer to projects coming out, to the point where I actually talked to Nick. So again, if I could reference this picture of him standing in Berlin, arms out, sleeves cut off, black flag t-shirt. The biggest users of Trailblazer are actually the German police department. Kind of ironic, kind of funny. Not trying to get political, but I think it's kind of a funny joke. Especially since he's such a punk rock guy. But yeah, Trailblazer is getting better and better. Now that it's reached a 1.0 level, it's actually something that's stable and really usable. So now I'm going to get a little controversial. Now we're going to go slightly controversial at a Ruby meetup. So like so many Rubyists, we should always take a look outside of our day-to-day stuff. So let's take a look at Phoenix for a second. The Elixir web framework created by Chris McCord, who is a former Rubyist, who did work on the Rails core for a little while. And he started working in Elixir, and he spotted the need immediately for a web framework. Chris was 100% influenced by Rails. Don't care what you hear him say at conferences, and continued to focus on the model view controller solution that would work in the new ecosystem that he was working with. So he couldn't find one. So of course he built Phoenix. It has a really cool name. Phoenix is fast. It's scalable. It makes it easy to build web interfaces and connect to backend applications. It's like super simple. If you've used Rails, and I'm going to take a flying leaping guess here, most of you have used Rails, you'll feel really at home with Phoenix. The MVC aspect is the same. Coding things up works generally the same way. The key being, as long as you are familiar with Elixir, which is a portmanteau of Ruby and Erlang, and I know you're familiar with Ruby, or at least getting familiar with Ruby because you're at this meetup, Erlang might be a different beast. And this might not be a weakness compared to the other things that we've looked at, but it might even be a fun exploration. You'll have to learn Elixir. That means learning functional programming, which is different than the object-oriented world of Ruby. It's not the same. You'll also need to learn OTP, which is the Open Telecom platform. That sounds super outdated and old and weird, and it is super outdated and old and weird. It's based on the fact that Erlang was used heavily, extremely heavily in the telecoms industry for trading packets over phone lines. Think old modems and war games and dialing things up and moving packets back and forth. That's a lot of how it worked. That's still a lot of where you see Elixir used today. They just borrowed the ease of typing from Ruby and gave it that kind of functionality. So Elixir is based on Erlang, which is a functional language developed by phone companies for packet transmission. So you're going to have to learn that, which is, it's like pretty cool stuff to delve into, and it's really interesting to learn. But if you're working on a project that has a timeline or a deadline, and it doesn't really say, hey, go use whatever you want and have a good time, maybe Elixir and Phoenix is not for you. Maybe try it out in your spare time, because everybody has so much spare time. There's a pandemic, right? So this is where Dan might get a little mad because he said he's going to learn more, but this is the sad point. There's no right answer. Your choice of framework 100% depends entirely on the project you're working on and the needs of your end users. And I say that because I feel like there should really be more pushback from Ruby developers on their project managers and product managers and people like that who say Ruby, Rails, that's the way to go. Take everything into consideration and maybe make a point that sometimes Rails isn't the answer. Sometimes that's not what you need. If you're building a landing page that's going to tie into something, maybe there's a different solution. If you're adding to a blog and you're finally, for the love of God, leaving WordPress, maybe Jekyll's the answer you're looking for. You don't even need to build a whole separate Rails application that ties in. There's lots of options out there. And as you explore other places, you'll find the things that you like and the frameworks you're most comfortable with. Defaulting to Rails is always an option. But remember, it's an option, which means there are other choices out there. Rails is here to stay. There's nothing wrong with that. People like Rails, and that's okay. It does a great job. But at the very least, we've seen there's alternatives to doing things in Rails. Just because, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room doesn't mean we have to pay attention to it. It means we should go out and explore other frameworks, except Almost Sinatra. Don't explore Almost Sinatra. Don't look at that. It's just a funny joke. But maybe, it'll inspire you to build the next best thing to Rails on your own. As with all open source, these things are yours to take, make, build, make better, and use. Don't simply do these things for the sake of doing them. Build the things that make better things for everyone in the community. And that's really where all these things come from. All of these frameworks are community-based. Rails is community-based. It solved a problem. You have to look at the problems you're trying to solve and figure out the framework that is right for the application that you're building. With that, my name is PJ. You can find me just about anywhere on the internet as a Splenic. I'm happy to answer why, although I think most people know this story by now. And I'm happy to take any questions anybody might have. There are 39 comments. Oh my God.
So I think I'll start if no one else is going to start. Thanks for presenting this. There's a ton of options, and that's really awesome. I love actually Hanami as just like the entire, like its whole project, the way that it's architected. I like a lot about it. I've been working on a project for a while, and I started out by working on it in Hanami, and I got to this point where I was just like, oh, I'm gonna have to build all this auth stuff myself. I'm gonna have to build all this all this S3 bullshit myself, all this stuff. And like, eventually, like, even though I liked the architecture of Hanami way more than the architecture of Rails, I was just like, Rails does all this other stuff for me for free, and I don't have to think about it. And like, I might not agree with the way that they do it, but they're handling it. And I'm one person. And so I guess my sort of question is like, it's more of a question comment, but like, there's trade-offs and everything. And like, how would you expect, like, what is your advice on how to decide where you should be on the spectrum of things that you've laid out tonight? Because like, I think there's a lot there.
Right. Absolutely. I think part of it is and that's really the main focus, and why I think the endpoint is the difficult, do what works best for you. But I think it also depends, like the whole thing is kind of, if you look at what we covered, like it's all about a ramp up. Like we started with Sinatra, which is super basic and super easy to use. I use Sinatra a lot for like, proof of concept stuff. Like, I don't even need a design. This is going to be Times New Roman, and it's going to be a simple form, but here's what I want it to do. So I use Sinatra, and then I step it up that line. And like, Hanami, I'm finding I'm using for more and more projects that are going to go into production. Like, to be perfectly honest, it's so valid. It's so easy to use. And it has that familiarity of Rails circa 2009, 2010. So not everything's there that I need to be, but it's still like easy to use and completely functional, and it's not going to fall over. And it's not, the other key thing, I think the important thing is, and it's not going to go anywhere. Because there are some that, like, even on that one card that I showed that had all that list of all those frameworks, I couldn't cover all of the Ruby frameworks in this talk. But like some of them have been completely abandoned, and some of them have been left by the wayside, and some of them are making a comeback. So it's all about like, how big is your project? What do you really want to do with it? How many people do you expect are going to use it? There's so many options. And I think the thing that I like, and I mentioned this a little bit, is like, we don't have wars over frameworks. We just have, and I'm seeing it in the comments, we just have a lot of people not seeing that there's more options out there. Like, at least I know you've been around doing Ruby for a while, so you've known about Hanami back when it was Lotus, before Luca got sued. But like, I think a lot of people, like, they're like, Rails, like Sienna said it best, Rails, Sinatra, yep, that's it. Because they like, it's like, it's like the marketing game. It's like, yeah, everybody knows about Slack. Not many people know about Mattermost, because one of those companies has $1 billion marketing budget.
So I have a bit of a cynical question.
Absolutely. I love cynical questions.
Why are we bothering at this point with these alternative frameworks?
Why are we bothering with
because
Rails?
let me explain my question. So like,
Sure.
I've been in so many Ruby shops now where the single worst, a very common framework decision paradigm would be that the worst decision was trying to do something unconventional because it either got abandoned, it was hard to hire for, like it's just like it plateaued and then like a new problem came out and that framework didn't address that problem. Like we were in our kind of chat before the meetup, we were kind of talking about like trying to decide what front end architecture to pick, like if we were going forward. And Elise kind of started this thread around like the most important thing being like, is this a good long-term solution? Like, is this actually going to be something that I can like build my company on top of? Because it's a bad framework decision to me seems to be like a very, like the worst kind of decision you can make as a company. Do you generally agree with that? Like it's really hard to recover from that decision compared to like almost any other technical decision we could make as engineers.
Yeah, I don't actually agree with that decision. And I'll tell you what, because the reason why is because if you're focusing too much on the framework, that means you're putting too much logic in the framework. With all of this, you should probably be writing more Ruby. If you're writing more Ruby, the framework essentially doesn't matter.
Have you? So you've worked you've worked in environments where that's the case. I've yet to see one. Now I'm just like an anecdata, pure anecdata, but I've yet to see a place where like plain old Ruby objects actually happen. And in fact, like coming from a PHP background, my experience was that the more you go in that direction where the framework doesn't matter very much, it actually leads to worse engineering quality, not better, because it's just kind of the wild west of patterns.
Well, I mean,
the reason I ask is like, I look at like the Hanami page, like you pull up in the Hanami framework right now, they have like their logos of who's using it. I didn't know one of those companies. And
sure, but I mean,
it's 2020. We've had all this time to develop all these alternative frameworks, and no, there's no traction. There's not much traction to these alternatives, and I definitely
don't agree with that.
I wonder if at this point, like whether there's really like a strong argument, like where people are actually seeing success, like large material success, starting new Ruby code bases that are reaching the scale that like Rails is and is being successful for other companies. Like, I just would have a really hard time making the argument when like I go to Hanami and like there's not one prominent example of the framework being used like at a large scale. You go to Rails, it's like, you name it, big names have started with it and or are even still using it. Like, are these frameworks are not mature enough? Are they like, are they not far enough along the cycle where like a company has become successful using them?
I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, Joel. I'm not gonna lie.
No, this is a very broad question. It's mushy. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's totally okay. I know Elise had something to say, but if you want to go first, that's fine. I have some thoughts on all this.
I mean, I think the only thing that I was gonna say is that like, in general, I don't think there's a one size fits all. So like this is hard because I agree both with what Joel said and with what my objection to him would be, and also what I think your objection to him would be, which is that like I think companies have to do what they think is going to be best for their own longevity going forward. Like if you're in a business situation, you have to make the decision that you think is going to be best for your business. And for a lot of businesses, that might be Rails. I was really drawn to Hanami from its architecture and just like understanding how their architecture, to me, when I looked at it, I was like, this makes so much sense. It comports with all of my preconceived notions and all of my preferences about how to build an architecture. I liked it a lot. And the big things that left me away from that were just, it didn't have all of the libraries that I needed. Like Rails had devise that I could use for authentication. It had active storage that plugged into S3, so I could use, that. And it was a lot of missing pieces. And it wasn't that I didn't think those were not worth building myself. It's just that like I don't have to build them myself if I use Rails. Like
I think a lot of
okay. Let me simplify my discussion.
I think at least
Let me simplify my question, because I think that I might have like been too broad. My hesitation with hearing about frameworks like this is they seem like they are engineering driven decisions that don't deliver business value. Like, I fully respect that these frameworks are a better vision for the world. What I struggle to see is that like they're actually a better business decision. And as engineers, I think that like it's really easy to like have a meetup discussion where we are like, oh, look at all these awesome, cool things we could do, when like I think it would be really difficult to make like a business argument for why you should use them over Rails.
Well, I'll actually, so here, I'll put this in the case of kind of an anecdotal story. It's a little bit about Engine Yard. So Kirk, bear with me here. I don't want to bore Kirk because he's heard all these fucking stories already. But so in 2018, Engine Yard was a platform as a service that was deploying Ruby on Rails applications still based on Gentoo. What it would do is look at your GitHub, you'd click and it would take your GitHub and it would deploy it to AWS. No containers, no Dockers, no nothing. This is in 2018 when everybody in the world is using Kubernetes. Because the company had changed hands a few times, there was no way for engineering to get it off the ground, even though engineering knows best practices to use Kubernetes or to use Docker. So at a Burger IM in Los Angeles during RubyConf 2018, while we were sitting there in our super fresh, super dope basketball jerseys that I designed to look like LA Lakers jerseys, but they said Engine Yard on them because that's what I do. We said, well, what if we just build it? We'll just build it. Because a lot of times, like what you're talking to, Joel, is you're talking to someone making a business decision. And sure, the easy business decision, especially when you present things like in Rails, you can get 90% of the work done in 10% of the time. That sounds great to someone who does business. Doesn't mean that you're building an application that meets your client's needs. And I'll give another great example that was like a super huge controversial thing back in like 2009. CD Baby wrote this big article about how they left Rails and they were going on to other stuff and they were doing JavaScript only. Well, that's because it was the new hottest and it was super exciting. In reality, they came back to Ruby. Their stack is now Ruby using Hanami with some other frameworks involved, some PHP and some JavaScript. And I think that's where we get a little too bogged down in the Ruby community, and the fact that we're thinking that people are still building applications that aren't just MVPs or proofs of concept, strictly speaking, in Ruby and Rails. No one's doing that anymore. You'll use Ruby, you'll use Rails, but if you want a large scale application, if you want to be the next Uber, you have a huge mix going on because you have to have a mobile application. Unless you're using Ruby Motion, which I'm pretty sure no one is using, you're not building a Rails app anymore. At least not a strictly Rails app. So why not use something you can use in open source and play with instead of using the thing that has already made all those decisions for you?
I do think that there's a little bit of a, like, I think some people here know that I'm a big fan of like a few Kent Beck quotes, but he has one about like everything's trade-offs and you just have to trade off. He has this like X thing that he does like at every presentation that he ever gives. Everything's trade-offs, right? And like I actually agree with the, like if you were to give me two sentences and one sentence was Rails is the best spot for most people to start their SaaS business with no external knowledge of anything else, I would agree with that statement. But if you were to give me a second statement that is, if you're building a Ruby application and you know roughly what your requirements are and you think you can get them without doing Rails and you think Hanami can meet those requirements with minimal build out and it's going to be like, then my answer would be yes, do that, because Hanami actually is faster. Like it's benchmarked faster. It does a lot of other things faster. It just doesn't have the plumbing that Rails has. Like Rails comes with a lot of plumbing, which is a virtue of being around for the last, what was it, 2004? So it's been around for 16 years at this point. Like it has a lot of plumbing. And if you don't need all that plumbing and you think you can build a lot of stuff yourself, then maybe you look at these other things. But if you're looking at your app and you're saying like, really, I just want to build an IS system that manages some database models and like, I don't care about building authentication myself, or building flat file storage myself, or building, like, if you don't care about any of this stuff, then use Rails. Like, it works.
Mhm.
Probably gives
And
you
I
what you
mean,
want.
and you're right, Joel. You'll see a lot of logos that are attached to Rails, because a lot of, like, it was from, I want to say, like 2009 until 2017, like the very thing that every Silicon Valley startup had to use. Like if they wanted to get the VC money as fast as they possibly could, that's what they used.
So
And
maybe let me
Rails
be
is
more
hard to back
specific
out
then.
of.
I think that if you're still writing Ruby, I think that you're ridiculous to not use Rails. That's
Okay.
kind of what I'm getting at. Is that, like, I think that, like,
I
when I see all these
I-
alternatives fracturing the Ruby landscape, and like Elise's story is like the story I've heard of every single time I've watched a team use one of these alternative frameworks. They get so close, they love it, it's so much fun, and then they're like, oh shit, I need to do that one thing Rails does, and the entire value of pursuing that framework falls on its face.
But
So-
I think that makes Ruby look like the laziest open source community ever, though. Because I mean,
It's mature.
seriously,
It's mature. We picked a winner.
No. Like I feel like that's the excuse. I honestly, like, this is why when you go into other communities, like, they don't have this, like, oh well, we've got our framework picked out, we're satisfied. We're good.
Okay.
We don't need anything else. That guy's going to come on stage every 2 years and he's going to say some really weird stuff and it's going to come out of his mouth. We're just going to roll with it. We're just going to accept it, even if we don't need it. And like Elise said, we're going to get a bunch of plumbing we don't need. We're going to get, we're going to get the Homer Simpson automobile. When we really just wanted a simple Toyota Camry.
I guess I'm trying to provoke the question, which is, like, I think that fundamentally at the root of a lot of these frameworks is a distaste for Rails. And I'm wondering if there's, like, maybe something fundamentally that isn't being discussed in the community where, like because there's a lot of energy in this conversation that seems to be that, like, a distaste for Rails. And I think that maybe that's the elephant in the room, that, like, people are so motivated that they will go build something that is 90% of Rails just to not use Rails. When, like, if Rails was 10% different, it would be better.
I think AJ has something to add to the conversation. Was that you? Somebody was making noise.
No, it was me, Kirk.
Oh, it was Kirk. Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Kirk.
No. Yeah. So, I think that one of the things with Rails, though, and maybe you can call it a distaste, but maybe it's just a assessment of the strengths and weaknesses. One of the weaknesses of Rails is that it's huge, and it's huge both in footprint as far as what you have to learn, and in footprint as far as your executable size and what you're running. And there are a huge number of sites and applications that just don't need that they don't need what Rails brings to the table. And from the beginning that the site is never going to need those things. And if it's never going to need them, why use something that is huge when you can use something that's more focused and has a smaller footprint?
Right. And also I feel like when people run into the issue of, well, Rails doesn't do the thing we want it to do, you're at the end of Europe. Nobody steps back from Rails. What they end up doing is they're like, well, then we're going to write it in Gatsby. We're going to write it in,
I agree with that.
I've seen tons of teams, like even like I know that the team at Weed Maps was like, well, Rails isn't giving us the performance we want. We're moving to Elixir. And it's like Elixir and Phoenix are like Rails and Ruby light. So they probably could have gotten the same performance bonuses out of Hanami, but Rails also sells itself as the end all be all. And Joel, I get what you're saying. I don't hate Rails. I really don't hate Rails. It saved me from writing Visual Fox Pro code in 2007. That is true.
No
And
way.
I don't know.
Another former Fox Pro developer. No way.
Oh my God. I think there's still like the meeting in Orlando that they used to have, and I think like 5 people show up and they're like, yep, we're still former Fox Pro developers.
Well, I used to live in Perrysburg, which is where it was developed.
No kidding.
Where it was, the creators were from Perrysburg, Ohio. Yeah.
Yeah, you should go by and egg their house.
Jesus.
It was that bad. It was horrible. But I've seen so many places that think that because Rails is a beast and it has these performance problems, the immediate thought isn't we should try to use something else, which if you had started looking at other options, maybe you would have never gotten to that point. But the option is always, we're going to completely change our stack. And that's detrimental to the Ruby community and it's detrimental to the Rails community. I've seen, we talk about seeing logos like on the Rails site. I've seen a lot of logos come off the Rails site.
Yeah.
And that's the crux of the problem. I don't think there's anything wrong with Rails, except for, it has some performance issues, which is true and we can't deny it. We as engineers don't generally care about that because we're delivering web applications. And like I said, the end users care about the 4 seconds. Did the entire application render in 4 seconds? If it didn't, I hit refresh. I will not hit refresh a second time.
I feel a little bit of a need to clarify my actual position. I do.
It's hard to do.
I actually do. No. So here's I think I do agree with Joel, right? Like a little bit, and I agree with Kirk a little bit. I agree with PJ. I do think that if somebody came to me as like a completely they know Rails, like a person knows Rails, and they're like, hey, I want to build this thing. Should I build it in Rails? I would say yes, 100%.
Yeah, definitely.
Go build it in Rails. I also think that, to kind of go back to the comment about Hanami and me choosing to not do Hanami and to abandon my earlier prototypes for Rails, I kind of will say that I do know a small number of people who have built things in Hanami that are in production that are maybe not necessarily the type of thing that I was building. They were building sort of I wouldn't call them microservices, but sort of in that vein of they have another web app that's connecting to a bunch of stuff, and they built things like that where they're using and those things have worked. I think kind of from my perspective, I sort of think that it's just I don't know that this is odd because I'm struggling now to articulate what my actual position is, but I actually agree with Joel that for most people Rails is probably the thing that you want to go with. Mm-hmm. But I also think that if Hanami had a more 100%, if Hanami had a more robust authentication framework at the time that I was building the thing that I'm building now, I 100% would have stuck with Hanami and just said oh, S3 is fine for me to deal with myself, right? The fact that it didn't have the authentication piece, it was this one piece that I was I don't want to build this super critical thing myself.
So are you done, Elise? Sorry, I want to drop.
Yeah, no, I guess I'm done. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling at this point.
She was just doing the classic, Northeast, finish your sentence with the word so, ...
Nice.
Yeah, it's a hard problem, and I don't have an actual answer, except to say that Rails might be the best option that you could have, but if you don't need Rails and you can do stuff with other things that are faster or give you better performance considerations, do that.
AJ, hold on. AJ just hit on a really important point too. The jobs are for Ruby on Rails. They're always for Ruby on Rails.
That is true.
Doesn't mean you can't once you get in there change it around, but it does mean that's who they're advertising for.
Think about the JavaScript landscape. I think we as the Ruby community are really lucky that another landscape has experimented with a lot more what I would call plurality in terms of architectures. And look what's happening. I mean, it's taken my entire career of 7-8 years now for React to win. But a lot of the stability from the JavaScript community has come from this coalescing around one solution. Even if you look at hiring, like you guys might remember 5 or 6 years ago, it was Backbone, React, MooTools, Yahoo UI. There was so much more plurality, and it actually made it really hard for companies to onboard people. One of the main advantages the Ruby community has is I think that our engineers are more flexible switching companies. It's actually why I think Turing makes a great decision to teach Ruby and Rails, because it's one of the more transferable job skills in our industry.
Absolutely.
And I think
I'm curious, Joel, what makes you say React won?
Hiring, just pure, plain and simple.
Because there's actually there's more Vue.js jobs than are React.
Then
yeah, so like it's
Well,
there's still and then Gatsby's made, like if you look at Tyobe, Gatsby's climbing the list too, and even though they're having like a complete community meltdown,
I guess
it's still happening, and Node is still huge.
So,
I mean, I'd like to just throw in real quick because I've seen this happen in the Java world too, right? Like Spring is where it is in Java, right? Like, and to me, the value, and you asked from a business perspective, right, Joel, which I totally understand and respect. Like to me, there's also the fact of these newer projects get to like be totally experimental and do things in a wildly different way that Rails wouldn't. And I think learning about them, and frankly, I think Rails benefits from that Cambrian explosion and pulling features back in, right? Like I think about, I'm not a Rails historian, but I think about Merb, right? Like that was an external project that got pulled into Rails. And I know that Rails has reacted to other things in the other ecosystems. So it's not just, it doesn't have to be just within the Ruby community, but I don't think as a wanting a vivacious like language ecosystem, you want to discount that aspect of it.
Yeah, so let me provide, maybe I can provide a little bit of like the quick summary of what my experience is that feeds this, my opinion, which is at GitHub, we've been ebbing and flowing along the like, oh, use the right tool for the right job, like breaking stuff out into Go, writing it in Go first, writing microservices, React only front ends that point to the monolith. Our long-term, like lots of very smart people working on this problem has resulted in more things going back into the Rails monolith. Because it is in the end, like in terms of like the actual long-term sustainable solution and not like a short-term like toy solution, like I think a lot of these frameworks succeed at. Like the momentum and the gravity of Rails getting better because it's just so big and like such an active project and has been an active project for a long time. Even like the performance question, I think that's an old trope that I think that I would want to like know where your opinion on Rails' speed comes from, because I think that like
benchmarks,
you can write slow code in anything, and most of the slowness in
that's
Rails doesn't come from
100%
Rails.
accurate. That's 100% true. Yeah.
So yeah.
So I do want to.
Most people aren't GitHub. That's what I would say.
What do you say?
What's that?
I would just say most people aren't GitHub. Most companies like GitHub.
Right.
Most companies
don't have Microsoft behind them to service them either. So,
let's not. I do think it's like an maybe an error to say like, oh well, GitHub has Microsoft behind them so they can field all these things. Here's what I will say. We have a lot of new people who are like new to the industry on this call. And I think maybe it's important to highlight that these are all like super technical decisions that like are dependent upon your current circumstance and what your business is trying to achieve. And learning, and sort of like not necessarily choosing what you want to use based on like it has to be grounded in what you're trying to achieve. Like you can't just say like, I'm going to use Hanami because I like Hanami and there's no business justification for it.
Right.
But at the same time, if you're going to use Rails and you're like, I want to use Rails, like I actually feel like Rails is a good default, to be honest. I do think that it does need to be stated that there's not a perfect solution and that it's always about trade-offs and what you're trading off. There are more Rails jobs, there are more Rails positions, there's more opportunity if you're a Rails developer right now. That's not necessarily the truth 20 years from now. I don't know. Like,
here's my final statement. I think you're more likely to make the correct decision choosing Rails than you are picking any other framework written in Ruby over the long term.
I would agree.
I would even extend that to you're probably, I mean, this is fully my opinion. You're probably better off deciding to use Rails than most other frameworks.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Outside of Ruby
100%.
included, like there's just so much garbage out there. And I mean, Joel, to what you're saying, like Rails really answers a lot of questions, and it's right there and it's built in and it's great. The point of this talk is more, and it's funny because you mentioned, you don't want to mess around with a production application and a toy thing. But when I started using Ruby on Rails, that a lot of people would say to me, why would you use Ruby and Rails? That's for toy applications. And I was like, we're deploying the largest survey application that the US college system has ever known using Ruby on Rails. And you made Craigslist Lite using PHP. But like that's the whole thing. I think eventually some of these things won't be toys. They'll be legitimate frameworks that people are using regularly in production. I don't think they'll ever approach the level of acceptance that Rails does. And they should, maybe they shouldn't. But the idea is to like explore and see different things in the ecosystem, support it, and do cool stuff. I think that's really like my main thing. Like, I'm not here to argue that any of these are better than Rails because I don't really think they are. But I think that especially for people that are new, know that there's options out there and see what you can play with. I know that like one of Kirk's favorite things is Crystal. We talked about it at great length for a podcast earlier this week. And like, I think Crystal's pretty awesome, but I watched that be a thing that everybody was like, what is this? Why is it's not doing anything? 10 years later, it's like kind of awesome and really fun. So, that's why I want to bring the attention to these things, because maybe someone will go play with it and maybe it'll be the next Hanami. Maybe it'll be the next Rails. Maybe it'll lead to a new JavaScript framework, God forbid. But
Jesus.
that's it. It's about go have fun, build stuff and see how it works. Sometimes it like I knew a lot of people that through Sinatra learned how to use the functionality of Rails by just adding things into their little personal project, like one at a time, because you're not seeing it all at once. So they're great learning tools. I don't think anybody's going to go out and be like, yo, I'm going to build my next application in Cuba. Don't do that. Don't build your next application.
You should put that as a testimony. You should put that as a testimonial on their repo.
Yeah, you should do that.
Because that would be my advice. That would be my advice too. Learn it, but don't build your next business.
Don't do this.
So, just as kind of like
I think Ryland's trying to talk now, and as the host, I think we should cede to his authority.
We should do that.
I'm trying to end the conversation. I was saying that we're not shooing people away from these things, because it's really interesting to learn concepts and implementations like Trailblazer and encapsulation and ways to keep things easy and tested. So just because we're kind of shouting down like, oh, nothing but Rails, but really what you're trying to do is expand how you approach problem solving, even if you bring it back to Rails.
Yeah. I think that's a big point. I also I recognize that it's been me and PJ and Joel sort of dominating this entire discussion. And I'm just curious if there are other people, maybe people that are new to Rails, who have questions about anything that we've discussed here, because I feel like it has been a lot of like people who've been in this community for a while who have dominated this conversation. So if anybody else has any questions, please speak up.
I've got something to say, and actually it's the exact opposite. I've been doing Rails for a long time. I went to the first Rails Conf in Chicago in 2006, right? So it's kind of funny because the old thing used to be no manager, no business decision. If you pick Java, would you get fired for? Right now it's Rails. Like, oh, if you pick Rails, you're probably not going to get fired for that either, right? So it's just, if you think Rails is the last framework that's going to come along, they're going to do it forever. That's not the case.
I don't think there's anything that you're going to do forever. I mean, I started doing Visual Basic, the ASP.NET, moved on to Perl and Visual Fox Pro, and then moved on to Ruby and Rails. Since then, I've done Go, Python, like everything. SQL is forever. Dan, you're not wrong. Although there was that whole NoSQL thing that happened, document stores, different things. I mean, it's all, everything's always changing. And I think that's kind of part of the message here too. Like, give everything a chance to change, evolve, and just find out more. Check out more about Grand Funk at your local library. But like, there's cool things. There's also so many things outside of the Ruby ecosystem that we can look at and learn from, and maybe come back and contribute to Rails or any of these frameworks and make them better. Like Buffalo, the Go framework, is like really rad, and people should check it out. And there's just different things. And I think that I've seen too many people that are like, okay, cool. So I do Ruby and Rails, and I'm not really willing to explore anything further. And they sit in the same job for 5 years and they're like, I don't feel like I've moved anywhere. And that's the big negative. Like even in just the Ruby space, there's more to explore. Don't assume you know where it is. And that's the main thrust there.
I would actually love to, especially to Lisa's point about some of the newer folks here, like what's an actionable thing you can do as a possibly a junior developer around this, right? PJ, like what would you suggest? Like, is it like read the documentation? Is it like run through a tutorial? Is it just be aware? Like what's an actionable thing? Especially, some of us are more senior than others and might have more direction and control. Others of us are looking for their first job. So I'd love to hear that.
And I think there's two sides to this. I think that, well, I mean, there isn't really though. I give the same advice that I give whenever someone asks me, like, how do I get started in open source? And that's you start with the documentation. My first journey into open source, the first open source project I ever contributed to was RVM. And it was all about rewriting things that Wayne Seguin had written that didn't make sense to anyone who wasn't Wayne Seguin. Which Kirk is nodding his head because he's worked with Wayne as well. Love Wayne, not the best documentation writer, but like, if you want to check out one of these frameworks or there's something else cool you want to look at, go look at the documentation, read through it, find language errors, or if you speak a second language, translate it, translate little bits of it. You're making this huge help to the community and you're going to learn as you go along. Because as you're going through documentation, you're going to want to try out things and say, oh, I'm going to give this a spin. I'm going to see how this scaffolding frameworks work. Like that's, especially for beginners, like that's the best way to get into it is read, look through documentation. And then, similar to what Sienna was saying in her talk, like think about it empathetically, maybe go write some tests, maybe help out the community by writing tests and getting better coverage in the project. That'd be cool of you. As you're doing that, you're continuing to learn more about the project, the framework, whatever it is that you're doing. So that's, not just for any of these frameworks, but any open source project. Start with the documentation. There's going to be something wrong there. You're going to catch it, fix it, and you'll start to feel more that you're part of that community and you'll start to build on the things that you're learning. I don't know. Did that answer the question? It got suddenly silent.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's great.
Did that answer the question?
It is 8:10, so I think we have.
Agree to disagree.
Okay. Just checking the chat there. Anybody else have anything else they want to ask before we wrap up? Especially if PJ or anybody.
I will say this. Thank you everybody so much for having me. And especially Joel, thank you. Like, I love it when people challenge me on my talks because the worst thing in the world is like, the old local band thing where everybody's like, hey man, great show. Good job. It's good seeing you.
I should just get a pair of devil horns for when I hop on Zoom because I'm always the advocate.
That's okay. I'm a developer advocate. The devil needs an advocate too. It's probably a good paying job.
It's a great paying job.
Yeah, I'm actually about to go do that at another. I'm doing DevRel Asia on Friday, but technically for them Saturday, where I'm going to go challenge every idea that everyone ever had about DevRel, and basically probably get in a lot of trouble. But I think that that's necessary for discourse in these communities. Like I don't feel like any of us were being animistic towards each other. We had a good discussion. I think a lot of good came out of it. I
think that what this really energizes me the most is to just improve Rails. Like, let's be real. I see all these frameworks on the screen. I'm like, wow, we got some work to do. And I think it actually comes down to governance. Like I get the impression that from this discussion that there needs to be more room in Rails for innovation. Like when we look long-term, like if this is going to be winning all the job post mind share, we need to make that framework better. It's really easy. It's easier to think you're making change when you're making an alternative solution. But when there's so much inertia behind the main one, even a small change there is going to have a huge effect.
I think this also matters. Yeah, I think this also matters, Joel, for what we were talking about kind of before the whole meetup started about like stimulus and turbolinks and about how that's not like a big open. Oh, Sienna was just like waving her finger. You have something to say? Go ahead.
Oh, I just heard about stimulus and turbolinks the other day, and I'm interested in like diving into that a little more in the coming weeks.
Oh, but like, oh yeah, definitely you should. I think Joel, this has bearing on our conversation about how like stimulus and turbolinks are developed behind this wall behind Basecamp where we get whatever they give us, and there isn't a lot of community engagement, and maybe we need more community engagement there to like help us build a community around those tools to build like a full service, I don't know, framework that does both things really, really well. I don't know.
And yes, more PRs. AJ, more PRs all the time. Always more PRs. There can never be enough.
If anyone here wants to write a PR, has an idea for a PR to Rails, I've landed quite a few lately, and I can help you like not make the mistakes everyone makes.
I have an
PRs
idea.
to Rails. I'm happy to help. You can put your name on it. You don't even have to put my name on it.
Everyone should be writing down Joel's name for that, right? I mean, if you're working Rails, which I don't do anymore very much, like to be able to say you committed to Rails or you put a PR that was successful in Rails is.
You want to know something crazy? If you want to be a top 100 committer to Rails of all time, you only have to land 100 commits in Rails. If that gives you an idea of the opportunity there is in that community still. I don't know.
Damn it, I should have
It's
done
actually, I
that
think it's
generator
81
PR.
commits. It's not 100 commits.
I should have done that generator PR. I messed it up. Joel actually told me like 7 months ago, Joel was like, I made this like comment in our Ruby chat that I was like, yeah, it really sucks that Rails generators don't bypass their own linting rules. And he's like, you should, there's a topic for this. You should just issue a PR. And I actually wrote the PR locally and then got sidetracked with a bunch of bullshit and never published it.
And then you know what's crazy? DHH himself came in and wrote your PR and landed it. DHH wrote it, which means your idea was like as good as gold.
Oh, that makes me feel worse.
To quote one of my kids, you know what? You'll never hit a home run if you don't step up to the plate.
That's true.
That's the most American thing I've ever said.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, I'm serious. My DMs are open, and by DMs I mean just emailing me. If anyone wants to work on if anyone has an idea for a Rails PR, my work doesn't care that much if I spend time with anyone just like working on a little bit of Rails stuff. Yeah.
All right. I'm taking this silence as an opportunity to thank you again, PJ. Super appreciate it. Sienna, also awesome. Super great night. Lots of good conversations. And that's kind of what we try to aim for, presentation night. So super success. Anything else anybody wants to say before we wrap up? Thanks again, PJ. Just to really.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Since your last talk. Dan, anything else? Are we good?
See y'all in January.